Thank you so much to the organizers for including our paper, and thanks to you all for tuning in. This is joint work with Klamanimbe, Rural to Urban Migration, Informality and Thermodynamics. Let me start my clock, so actually I don't go over time. So the motivation for this paper is that, for a long time now, rural to urban migration has been seen as a potentially powerful engine of development. This goes back to the 50s even. However, the empirical literature has typically found evidence that doesn't support that view. So it's a more consistent view with Harris-Todaro that immigration actually especially internal migration, leads to higher informality and higher non-employment at destinations, at urban areas. And in fact, this, as I said, consistent with this Harris-Todaro view that rural migrants, when they arrive to urban areas, they tend to join a queue for the limited number of formal jobs in those areas. This is also consistent with a dual view of informality, for example, where the informal sector and the formal sector occupy completely different spaces in the economic sphere. However, a missing link between immigration and labor market effects at destination in the literature has been firm dynamics, and that's the one we're going to focus on this paper. Immigration often represents a sizable supply shock to destinations, which can have first-order effects on firm dynamics, in particular firm entry. So if you're familiar with the literature on the startup deficit in the US, that's kind of the mirror image in a sense of what we're going to explore here today, because there, the slowdown in demographic growth led to a slowdown in labor supply, and that led to a reduction in firm entry. And here in our setting, in any developing country, in fact, informal sector is likely to play a key role, especially for low-skilled migrants, in terms of being the entry door into these urban economies. So in this paper, we asked the question, what are the effects of rural to urban migration on formal firm dynamics, and how that translates into overall labor market consequences and aggregate outcomes as well. So what do we do? How we go about answering this question? Well, we proceed in two steps. First, we take the shift-share IV design that's state-of-the-art type of approach in this literature to identify reduced form effects of this immigration flows into the urban destinations. We examine firm dynamics and labor market outcomes in Brazilian municipalities. For that, we use granular data both on land use, but also climate shocks to construct push shocks in rural areas. And we also explore previously existing migration networks to construct the instrument for this shift-share IV design. We rely on the richness of the Brazilian data that has matched employer-employee for the universe of formal firms and workers, plus detailed information from demographic censuses. But there's so much we can answer with a reduced form approach. In this case, in particular, we cannot speak to general equilibrium effects. Therefore, we move to the structural analysis. In a sense, we structurally estimate a model of firm dynamics that has two margins of informality, the extensive and intensive margins. We estimate this model and do counterfactors to understand both G effects of these shocks, but also the different mechanisms at play. And we look at the effects of a particularly strong migration shock that corresponds roughly to the 80th percentile of in-migration rates in our data. So we use different data sources for this. I don't have obviously time to go over them, but we use the decennial population census, matched employee data for both formal firms, but also informal firms to estimate the model. And then we construct push shocks using crop prices and climate data and previously existing migration networks between all municipalities in Brazil. So let me summarize the reduced form results that we find in this paper. As you can see here, the basic equation of interest is quite simple. We look at decadal changes in different outcomes. We look at decadal changes because that's disciplined by the demographic census, that's the decennial census. And we're interested in the relationship between these outcomes and the in-migration rates over the previous decade, over the decade into a given destination municipality, controlling, of course, by different characteristics. In-migration rates are an endogenous regressant. That's why we need the shift-share instrument. In terms of an effect of a 1 percentage point increase in migration rates, we observe a 2.2% increase in the number of formal firms and a 1.8% increase in the number of formal jobs. That's followed with that goes together with a declining wages of nearly 3%. These results are mainly driven by entry. So there is a substantial increase of 5.5 percentage points in firm entry that produces these effects in terms of firm dynamics. And that leads to an increase in the share of formal workers, and that's quite substantial. And this effect on the share of formal workers is driven not by differential exit into non-employment, because non-employment is actually not affected, but native workers moving from informal to formal jobs. I have 10 seconds according to my clock here that I would have to talk about the model and what it does. I'm happy to take questions about the model itself. So let me just say that in terms of the results of the model that we estimate using the microdata from the zoo, this is focusing at effects at destination. What we see is that the GE effects are broadly consistent with what we've just showed you in terms of the effects coming from the reduced form analysis. Informality declines, wages decline as well, but the number of formal firms increases in regions affected by this positive supply shock. However, when we look at aggregate outcomes, total output and income increase, but they increase by less than 10%, which is the shock that we are simulating here in this economy, leading to an overall decline in per capita terms in total output and income. And the reason for that is that the firms that benefit the most from the supply shock are actually located in the bottom of the productivity distribution. These are the ones that benefit the most from the inflow of workers. So in fact, the reallocation of labor is not favoring a substantial TFP gains through reallocation. Just to conclude then, what we show in this paper is that immigration increases entry amongst formal firms. That leads to a higher number of formal firms in equilibrium and more formal employment, but lower wages. And that's in contrast with most of the literature that typically finds that rural to urban migration leads to an increase in informal jobs or unemployment. And so that suggests that in principle, developing countries could be experiencing demographic dividends from internal migration. However, what we find in our counterfactual exercises using the structural model is that this is not enough to produce overall gains in per capita terms at receiving areas, and in particular because these shocks are producing not producing a reallocation of factors to more productive firms. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Can I ask a question? This is fascinating work. I just want to ask the clarification about the last kind of overall productivity statement. But are you comparing this counterfactual where nobody's moving? Imagine there's a really bad climate shock in the agriculture sector and people cannot move. I'm guessing it will be worse than when these people can move to different area, even if they will be working for very unproductive farms.
Sorry, can you broke down a little bit for me? Can you just repeat like the last say half?
Oh, sorry. So what I have in mind is I just want to understand what the question is. So imagine there's a bad climate shock in the rural area, but people cannot move. That's case number one. And case number two is when these people can actually move to urban areas and they work for unproductive firms. My guess is that case number two is still better than case number one, right?
Yes, absolutely. So we're not speaking to the situation, the counterfactual where there's no mobility, but actually what we are focusing in preliminary results is to combining this shock with actually, for example, increasing enforcement to reduce the ability of informal firms to hire these workers, or low productivity formal firms to hire informal workers. And actually, combining higher enforcement with these inflows of individuals actually leads to local economies reaping greater benefits from this dividend. So it's not contrasting that with the lack of mobility, if that's more clear.
Thank you. Great work.
Thanks.
Jonas, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. Just one quick question. So how to think about the experimental variation, like the people that go into the urban sector? So these are kind of small shocks, right? So I'm wondering how much can we extrapolate from them to like bigger rural urban migration that might have different effects on?
You mean comparing the results, say, in the experimental literature prior to our work to this movements that we are looking here? Is that what
no, sorry, just so explicitly you have the experimental variation that you get, like the causal effects you get, that you get them from a specific set of experimental variation, right? Or like not experimental, but kind of
yeah, quasi, yeah.
Exactly. And so how to extrapolate from this kind of to bigger rural urban migration that.
Well, these movements, it's a super rush, but this is exactly the movements that we are using. This is the type of variation we're using the data. Like actually, so we have a lot of variation in terms of the size of the relative size of these inflows depending on different destinations. But like you can get as high as a 10% increase in terms of inflows in our setting. And this is because they are and again, like the push forces vary in intensity, but actually some locations are hit by quite strong drought shocks or price shocks relative to so the relevant land use of the origin, right? So actually we have a lot of variation on that dimension, and we are simulating as I said, like the 80th percentile of the in-migration that we observe in the data. So we are looking at a strong shot. We can of course do different sizes in the simulations to see how non-linear these effects are in terms of G. I think maybe that's what you have in mind as well, right? So
yeah,
that would be
already
an
this
interesting,
super nice things.
Yeah, thanks.
Tommaso?
Yes, first, super interesting work. Just a clarification question. So on your empirical result, I didn't understand kind of the magnitude because everything was referring to different bays. So the question is, for every 1,000 people that go into a new city, what share of this is absorbed by formal firms? And is it actually more than 1,000, the new jobs created in formal firms, or less than 1,000?
So we were comparing relative magnitude. So there's definitely a difference in terms of the size of the markets that receive these migrants. So but we are looking at the relative size in the receiving region. But even controlling for the size of one thing we can do, and we do, is controlling for the size of the receiving local market, and that doesn't affect the magnitudes of the results.
Gabriel, I think the question was on just the interpretation of the magnitudes. If you go back to the slide.
Sorry. Okay, so that's
results.
Easier.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
sorry.
You'll see.
I thought, because again, we had to rush it. So we're looking at a 1 percentage point increase in the inflow of migrants. That's roughly 15% of a standard deviation that we see of the flows we see in the data. Okay.
I guess, I guess, and sorry to take too much time, but so the 1.8% in the number of formal jobs increase, I think will be very useful to compare just the number of these jobs to the number of migrants. So essentially, and I think we cannot do it from this magnitude. So essentially, to really get a point that there is 1,000 new people, there are more than 1,000 new jobs, formal jobs created, or less than 1,000 new jobs created. That again was
that's a good point. Sorry, I completely misunderstood your question. Yeah.
No, I think the comparison with the 0.4 percentage point increase in the
shares.
Maybe that's relatively comparable because the denominator is roughly the same, and that gives you the sense of.
But we can but we can do better. We can do more in terms of trying to break down this by natives and migrants themselves, right? Like that. I think that's also what you would like to see. So but the overall share kind of gives you the magnitude of the effect.
Marcus?
Yeah, that was very interesting, and I would have a bunch of questions, but in the interest of time, just one clarification question, which is about the timing of what you estimate and also the model, right? So there's this shock, people move, something's going to happen on impact, and then there's going to be an adjustment, it's going to take time. So I didn't get fully in the estimates, at what kind of horizon do you estimate these things? Is that the short-term impact? And in the model, is that a comparable short-term thing, or is that the long-term consequence?
Oh, that's a good point. So the model is, of course, about steady states. And here we're looking at decadal changes and immigration over a decade. So these are fairly long time horizons. So one thing that we want to understand, so one thing that I didn't have time to show you today is that because we have annual data from the formal sector, we can actually see dynamic effects to see if they keep going on, if they level off at some point. And in fact, they do tend to increase, but they never revert back. And that's something that I can show to you. And the second thing we're doing right now is that in the census data, we can actually distinguish between people that have arrived in the past 5 years or 6 to 10 years, and explore the different effects from this longer versus shorter term migration to see exactly have a sense of the effects you have in mind. So these are things we're doing right now. Some of them we could have shown, but it would be impossible to do this in this time window. But thanks,
I believe Mandy's kept the room open for a bit longer, so I think you can take one more question.
Brilliant.
Joe?
There's a question of, could you go to the last slide?
Absolutely.
I was curious about the last bullet point, which is sort of that there's no aggregate gains. And I was trying to reconcile them with the other stuff. Can you just, obviously we didn't see the model, but can you give us a little intuition on why that is?
So what's happening, in aggregate, there are positive effects on total output and income. However, they increase by less than 10%, which is how much we are shocking this economy with new people arriving. So in per
But
capita terms,
why doesn't formalization lead to, there's a gap between formal and informal marginal
no. So
product.
actually, here, yeah, there's heterogeneity at the firm level in productivity. Firms are self-selecting into being either fully informal or formal, and if they're formal, they can hire informal workers or not. And the thing is, what's happening here is essentially that the supply of labor is because like, it's increasing the number of formal firms, but the formal firms that are receiving most of this labor are actually located at the bottom of the distribution. So they're still fairly small and unproductive, even being formal. So it's not that the most productive firms in the formal sector that are absorbing these
But
workers.
they're actually less productive than the informal on the margin or something.
Some of them can be, yeah, some of them can be, but they're like essentially the elasticity of the output, the total output is not enough to compensate for the massive arrival of people in this. And
it's not due to capital, like it's not due
No,
to
we
capital
don't,
labor
no.
ratio falls or anything.
No.
Okay.
So that's a good point. Actually, like we don't have capital in this model. It's all loaded in the firm level TFP in a sense. So
I think that's right for a steady state model. That's fine. That's how you should do it. So.
But we might be underestimating the benefits of formalization here because there are no technological differences. That's what I was going to say.
Yep. Okay.
Great, thanks. I think Mandy will close them shortly, so I'm going to stop recording.